Okay, I'm going back to this slide for a reason as your review, because I want to really focus on a few things as we go through this. I'm going to move quickly, but I want you to know that for testing purposes, for the things that I want you to understand and know, you will find every bit of it within the PowerPoint and then go to your book and reference. So we've talked about homeostasis. I'm not going to cover that again. I said that in lecture, you can read that. We talk about water and how it's so important. We've got to have it. Why water? We are water. That's why. I love my little picture, but anyway, just remember that it's more in men, there's more in lean people, more in children and less in elderly. It's 60% of our weight is water. There is no water in alcohol. So we have an alcoholic that becomes an issue. 2,000, 3,000 milliliters a day. If you have a fever, you'll need more. Because what are we doing with a fever, right? We have an increased metabolism. And also we could be profuse, sweating, perspiring. Sodium is that major extracellular electrolyte. It controls and regulates water balance. We have to have salt. It is married to chloride, sodium chloride. Makes it kind of easy, doesn't it? When you think about it that way. Always think neuro with sodium. Wherever sodium goes, water is going to follow. So if it's out in the vascular, if it's out in that extracellular, you're going to have more volume out there. If it goes inside the cell, then we're going to have more volume inside the cell. It'll follow it. Remember I said water is like a stalker. It's following sodium around. Remember foods, look through the foods, because you do want to remember like condiments and things like that. It really plays into their sodium intake. And so the client really needs to understand. Potassium, major intracellular electrolyte. And it's going to help maintain intracellular water balance. And the reason why is it's inside the cell. It's sitting there. And when it's inside the cell, sodium doesn't want to come in. It'll stay outside. But if sodium does come in, the potassium is going to leave the cell. And so you want the right amount of potassium inside the cell, the right amount of sodium outside the cell, and things just maintain. We have that, homeostasis. We have everything just doing what it should do. When things start to shift, we have osmotic pulls with potassium and sodium, then we have issues, and that's where we'll have fluid go into the cell or out of the cell, depending. And just think of it this way too. If we have poor renal function, we're going to have higher potassium levels. If we are urinating excessively, meaning we have a diabetic emergency, then you will urinate a lot and it will pull the potassium, you'll lose it. If we're taking a diuretic like Lasix furosemide, you're going to lose potassium. And then you have diarrhea and vomiting, two other ways that potassium, we lose it. And so we would need to replace it. It'll decrease, be hypokalemic. And always remember potassium cardiac. These are foods to find potassium. We know bananas is one of the first things we always think of. If I ever saw that, I would probably choose bananas. But then there's other choices like oranges, dried fruits, tomatoes, avocados, dried peas, meats, broccoli, dairy products, and whole grains. Chloride, I didn't tell you to know. Just know that it's married to sodium for now, and it will decrease with vomiting and diarrhea. Calcium, though, I do want you to understand and know. Know those lab values. Remember, we're looking at the lab values in the book. Contractions, blood clotting, formation of bones and teeth. Blood clotting, I should highlight that big and bold. If you're cold and you have low calcium levels, you will have trouble clotting. We're not going to talk about phos, but it is just an inverse relationship with calcium. So if your calcium is high, your phos will be low and vice versa. Here are sources of calcium to look through. They're there, dairy, cheese, of course, yogurt. But I like the kale and the broccoli and the grains. I think people need to understand they can get calcium from that, and that they have to have vitamin D to absorb calcium. It's so important. Magnesium is one you do need to know also. And I think it might be 1.2 or 1.3. I might be wrong, but please use the numbers that are in the chart in your book. It is so vitally important. But magnesium does a lot. It is the powerhouse. It is what we need to produce our ATP, which that's the fuel, right, for active transport. We want to promote carb, fat, and protein metabolism, and it also powers our sodium potassium pump. And this has to do with all of our renal and all of what's going on in the system. So magnesium is vitally important. It relaxes muscle contractions, smooth muscle, and whole grain nuts, dried fruit, green leafy vegetables, dairy products, tuna, and you can find it in chocolate. Yay. These are lab values still. I talked about them. You're going to look at that BUN and creatinine to look at your kidney function. And this will be based on hydration. So if you're overhydrated or dehydrated, you're going to see an alter in these numbers. Hematocrit too. Total protein albumin, it'll pull fluid, and we've got to have so much albumin to hold on to our protein and our volume, our fluid. If we don't, we third space. Things go elsewhere and we have trouble. So it's important. We can look at albumin levels. We can also give albumin. Just FYI, we have it, we make it, and give it. It's also known as a volume expander, just FYI. So we can give that while we're in lieu of waiting for blood in a hypovolemic state. Now we talk about osmolarity particles and osmolality particles, and we're going to say OSMO. And take out that it's just particles per liter or particles per kilogram. We're talking about the same thing, so don't get real hung up on is it osmolarity or osmolality, because that will freak you out and you don't need that. Just think osmo, take those endings off. If it's high osmo, you're going to have water deficit. It's going to be concentrated. If it's low water, if it's low, you're going to have water excess and you're going to be dilute. And it's opposite. So if your urine is really dilute, you're going to have concentrated serum or blood. And if your blood is really dilute, you're going to have concentrated urine. So it's flip opposite when you're looking at osmo. So the one thing that I do want you to understand, and I love to use, is the Kool-Aid analogy. If I'm making a packet of Kool-Aid, and I think I use cherry Kool-Aid in class, but because of blood, I guess I always go to cherry, but I love orange Kool-Aid would be my favorite. So if you're making my orange Kool-Aid, and I've got a 2-quart pitcher or a 3-quart pitcher, and I make less, put a 1.5 quarts of water in my pitcher to make the Kool-Aid, it's going to be concentrated, right? So I have less volume. My water is deficit. I don't have as much, so it will be a more concentrated product. Same with if I put too much, it's going to be dilute. So just kind of think of it in those analogies. So I'm making the Kool-Aid, if I don't put enough water in it, I'm water deficit, it's concentrated. And then if I put too much, I put a 1/2 quart more in or something, it would then have water excess and be dilute. And just remember, if one is up, the other is down. So if my blood is concentrated, then my urine would be dilute, and vice versa. If my blood is dilute, my urine's going to be concentrated, because what I'm doing is holding on to fluid in the system. And that's why the blood would become dilute and our urine then would become concentrated. And then if I'm pulling tons of volume and getting rid of it in urine, my blood's going to be concentrated and my urine will be dilute. That's a lot of concentration and dilution. Moving on. We know about intracellular fluid. You know that's potassium and phosphorus in that. Potassium is what I want you to understand. Intracellular deficit, this is a definition. Just know that if we have these issues, we can have neurological disturbances and seizures in children. Children are very susceptible to seizures. They can have high fevers and have seizures, but this is also another cause. Extracellular fluid, we know that that is made up. The number one electrolyte is sodium that's in that extracellular fluid. And just remember, transcellular fluid is your cerebral spinal fluid, pleural, peritoneal, but this all makes up, interstitial and transcellular all make up extracellular fluid. It just divides it out so that you understand that this is considered interstitial. It bathes and surrounds all of our tissues, and then transcellular fluid. But everything is affected if we have dehydration and different disease processes. Where do we draw labs? Remember, extracellular fluid. So if I have a lot of potassium out there, then I don't have a lot of potassium inside my cell, and that's not good. So then I would need to give fluids, the physician would choose between an isotonic, hypertonic, or hypotonic solution to help push back or pull out whatever's floating around in that extracellular fluid. So if it were potassium and I want to be pushing potassium back into the cell, I want to push things back in, then I'm going to have to give something. What would I give? Hypertonic, right? So that I can push it back into a cell and have fat, juicy cells, put that potassium back in. Now, kidney, it senses low sodium. Then it's going to release renin. This is this renin-angiotensin system, the RAS system. And we want you to get a grip on this, is a good way of saying it. So if you sense low sodium, if the kidney senses low sodium and low volume, either or, it's going to release renin because it's going to go, hey, I need to hold on to salt. It's going to convert angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, and then it's going to convert to angiotensin 2, stimulate the release of aldosterone, and it gets our RAS system going, okay? So first of all, what happens is we're hyponatremic, or we are low volume. We have low volume, okay? So the kidneys, the adrenal cortex, will sense low serum osmo, so we have a low blood osmo, right? So that means we have dilute blood and low urine. We have concentrated urine. So we have concentrated urine and low sodium. We'll release aldosterone, and then we're going to reabsorb sodium into the blood, which will increase the potassium excretion in the urine. So we're going to start to hold on to sodium, and we know when sodium is present, potassium doesn't want to be in the same room. It's just a bad marriage. So sodium is reabsorbed into the blood, and because of that, potassium is going out the door. It's going to be excreted through the urine. Then it's going to, by pulling that sodium back into the blood, what are we going to do? Increase our serum osmo. And remember, wherever salt goes, water follows. So if we have a low serum osmo, or low sodium, we're going to release that aldosterone, reabsorb the sodium back into the blood, which then potassium wants to go out the door. It's gone, it's going out the urine, and that'll increase our serum osmo. Where salt goes, water follows. It's going to hydrate. Just pause for 1 second because I want to share one more thing with you. Okay, so let's move forward. I might go back to that if we still have questions. The hypothalamus actually, since it's high serum osmo or high sodium, it's going to stimulate thirst. So if we have a high serum osmo, that's that blood, if we have a high blood osmo or high sodium, then it's going to stimulate thirst because it's going to say, I'm thirsty, salty. Trigger the release of ADH, which is vasopressin from the posterior pituitary. So our brain's going to go, that posterior pituitary is going to go, woo, and it's going to release ADH, which is vasopressin. And vasopressin is a constrictor. So it's going to retain water in the blood. It's going to concentrate your urine. So we're going to hold on to water in the blood, and it's going to concentrate urine because our urine is then not going to be, we're going to have excess urine. It's like, let's hold on to water. Let's hold on to water. And then our urine becomes concentrated. So if our blood is dilute, our urine will be concentrated, and vice versa, that, inverse reaction. So mildly constrict blood vessels and decrease our serum osmo. So by doing this is what decreases our serum osmo, our blood osmo. I'm going to say this one more time. So if we have a high serum osmo or high sodium level, it's going to stimulate thirst. It means we want to drink. So it's when the brain does that, it's going thirsty. We're going to trigger then the release of ADH, which is the antidiuretic stimulating hormone, which is ADH is vasopressin. Our body makes it, and it comes from the posterior pituitary. So that's why it's so important that you understand our brain is doing this. We're doing things here. So vasopressin, and I have it in capitals, I just want you to understand it is a constrictor. Vasopressin is a big constrictor. It's a big thing that wants to do a lot. So this is big time stuff. So what happens is it's going to retain water in the blood, which means it will concentrate our urine, which that mildly constricts our blood vessels. So we're causing this constriction. That's why the vasopressin, that's what it's doing. It's mildly constricting blood vessels. And then we're going to decrease our serum osmo by doing this, our blood osmo. Just an FYI, and I've got it in big, bold letters. If you don't get any of that, read over it. It will come. Just read slowly, read out loud. It comes. You just have to kind of picture it. But I want you to know this for fact. Aldosterone protects sodium balance, and ADH is opposite of aldosterone. So water is down, ADH is up. Okay? So if we have low volume, low water in the system, if we're dry, then our ADH will be up. It's going to stimulate, right? So that then we can do what we did in the previous slide. So our heart is an interesting thing. It senses high volume through stretch receptors in that right atrium. So our heart will stretch, but it will secrete different peptides, but it can inhibit, when this happens, it'll inhibit ADH, which when it does that, it's going to stop the RAS system. So it'll increase our sodium excretion through urine. So we'll have an increase in urinary output. Dilute blood vessels decrease in blood volume. Okay. So if our blood vessels are dilute, if we've got fat, juicy little blood cells, we're going to actually have a decrease in the circulating volume around it. So you know how if blood's floating around, it's got to float in volume, right? It's got to float in something. It's got to float in the river of plasma, whatever, all the things that we have. If that's the case, and we have a little cell floating along, but then the cell says, I'm going to start being a little sponge and just suck up fluid. If it starts to suck the fluid up out of the river, what happens? We're going to have a decrease in the river volume, right? But the blood cells are going to be big and fat and juicy. They'll be dilute, but this equals the decrease in blood volume. The river will go down. So the big sponge is bigger. It's sucked up all the fluid, and the river has gone down. So dilute blood vessels, big fat, juicy blood vessels equals a decrease in blood volume. And that decreases your serum osmo. We talked about spacing. I'm moving on. First spacing is normal, of course. We have second spacing, but that third spacing is that fluid that's trapped, and it is not good. It is fluid that is not available for use. We can't do anything with it, and that's ascites, burn, and burn edema. We have the fluids, isotonic is equal, and then we know, and I show a picture about hypertonic and hypotonic that I love, where cells are shrunk or cells are fat and juicy, okay? Isotonic will be equal, and there's your fluids, no fluid shift. Hypertonic, it's thicker than the body fluids, so it causes the cell to shrink. So we're going to pull fluid, because it's thicker, it's pulling fluid out of the cell, okay? And we can risk we can be at risk for fluid overload because we're pulling it out of the cell and into that circulating, into that extracellular area. We're going to overload things if we're not careful. Intravascular. Hypotonic, it's thinner, and because it's thinner than the body fluid, it's going to pull fluid inside the cell. The cell is thicker, so it's going to pull it inside that cell and hydrate the cell. And by doing that, you can deplete your circulating system. So hypertonic, we can overload the system, and hypotonic, we can deplete the circulatory system. And in that, you just have to understand that's what's going on. Half normal saline is the one that we see a lot. Plasma expanders, that's what I want you to understand. They're volume expanders. Albumin is one. And then there's colloids and dextrin. Albumin is considered a blood product. So culturally, if that's an issue with people, then you would not give them albumin and you would go with another type of plasma expander or volume expander. Fluoride, we're not going to focus today, but just know it's married to sodium. They're snotty. They don't like potassium. And then I have this to know your electrolyte imbalances. These are the ones that I want you to know. Know the values, know the levels, and know what's going on in your system. And then this is the thing, and we pull everything. There's hormonal regulation, acid-base balance, all of that. Quick review.